But right now, I want to welcome to the program Dr. Kyle Scott from Duke University. Dr. Scott, how you doing tonight?
You.
Great. Thanks so much for coming on the program. I ran across your article at Blog Critics a couple of days ago, The Fallacy of Gun Control Laws, and I thought that this was really interesting because it's a perspective, quite frankly, I'm not used to seeing from college professors.
Yes, that's true.
So, all right, so let me ask you, first of all, the basic premise behind your piece, and we'll get into some specifics here, but the basic premise is what? That passing another law is not going to affect the violent criminals because they're not paying attention to the laws that are already on the books?
Sure. For the most part, it's a common sense argument that gun or advocates for gun rights have been arguing all along. But the motivating basis is that in order to be a criminal, particularly a violent criminal, it's not just laws which will guide your behavior, but your schools, your churches, your families, that more needs to go into cultivating character than just constructing new laws. Laws are insufficient in constructing behavior.
You know, and again, that seems like such a common sense thing to say, but it goes back to the idea of individuals being responsible for their individual behavior, which is antithetical to the gun control movement, which preaches that if we simply remove guns from society, both legally owned and illegally possessed firearms, that is what is going to make us safer.
Sure. And when people use firearms for violent crimes, rather, it's not the guns which are causing the crimes necessarily. Rather, it's indicative of a deeper problem within the society or the person that motivates them to be violent. And guns don't motivate people to be violent. They're merely a weapon when people choose to be violent.
All right. So, how did you, Dr. Scott? How did you decide on the veracity of this argument? What led you to these conclusions?
Plato.
Plato.
Simply, Plato's Phaedrus. Oddly enough, when I start teaching the common law classes, I introduce it through Plato's Phaedrus. And that's very much the argument that he makes, is that laws are insufficient for constructing behavior because laws are static, unmoving things, whereas people in society are always varying, always changing, and we need to be adaptable and amenable to the individual and not treat everybody as the same because everybody's not the same. And this is very much in line with how I see the founders sort of operating through the constitutional system, which is a limited federal system of government in which that which is closest to the individual can best help regulate and govern the individual, because the individual can also respond back to the government most effectively.
Interesting. And so you write, laws are not useless, but to think of them as the only answer or the best answer is wrong-headed. And, I got to say, Dr. Scott, I could not agree with you more. A lot of what we're talking about here really are cultural issues. We have listeners who grew up in New York City or Chicago in the 1950s or 60s, and they'll sometimes write in with stories about taking their 22 on the subway when they rode to high school, so they could then go and practice in the range located in the basement of their high school. Now, I don't think that adolescents, generally speaking, have all of a sudden regressed over the past 50 years. But it seems like within these urban areas, perhaps it wasn't as important in the 60s and 70s to raise responsible gun owners, to expose teenagers to the proper handling of firearms. And so we lost not only the responsible teenagers, but we lost the idea that it's good for these adolescents or young adults to have that responsibility.
Well, and right, and it begins, though, I think is what you were intimating, that begins with that familial relationship between the parent and the child and raising them, not turning on a video game and letting them blast fake aliens with fake guns in lieu of you taking your child out and practicing safe gun control.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, you point out some of the statistics that we talk about in this program all the time. The states in the country with the lowest homicide rates are Vermont and New Hampshire. Those are states that the Brady campaign really, they don't like the gun laws there because, they say they're very, very lax. You look at the violent crime rate in California. The Brady campaign says California has the the best gun laws in the country. Their violent crime rate is a little bit higher than Texas, and the Brady campaign hates Texas. So, clearly the presence of gun control laws on the books does not automatically, or I shouldn't even say automatically, does not necessarily make you a safer state or a safer city.
Sure, no more than having laws against murder does it prevent murders. It merely provides a punishment for the murder, but it doesn't deter people from murdering who are already going to murder.
Okay, so based on this, and again, I think what you're saying is absolutely common sense here, but I'm guessing that it's very controversial in academia for you to say these things.
Well, it can be, depending on where you are, and how you couch the terms. Which is why I like to situate the way in which I present the argument in terms that are familiar and supported by academics, and showing that, look, this is something that you support. Use the vernacular of academia and just say, this is a different way of putting the sort of the common sense argument, which they seem to be much more amenable to or acceptable to, hearing it in their own words.
Oh, really? So,
sure.
Okay, well, that's good.
Because then we can talk about the proper method in which Plato ought to be read and those sorts of things, and then they realize that, that there's reasonable people can disagree about these things, and because you support gun rights doesn't mean you're a wacko, and just because you oppose gun rights doesn't mean that you're a fascist, but that we can actually communicate between one another and sort of find a common footing.
Yeah. Well, what's fascinating, I mean, I've had the opportunity over the course of hosting this program to talk to a lot of people who are Second Amendment supporters, but they're not even gun owners. That's, I guess that's where I'd really like to see this argument sort of make inroads. You don't have to be pro-gun to understand that a one-gun-a-month law is not going to do a lot to reduce violent crime, or that a firearms owner identification card is not going to prohibit a gangbanger in Chicago from illegally obtaining and carrying a firearm.
Absolutely, and I just to further, I guess, stress or draw the parallel in your point is that I don't have to be an active protester in order to support free speech in the First Amendment. So I don't have to be an active gun owner, hunter, how they would typically like to portray gun owners in order to find value in Second Amendment rights.
Absolutely. Talking with Dr. Kyle Scott from Duke University. And let me ask, Dr. Scott, what kind of reaction did your piece receive? Have you gotten any criticism?
Oh, yes, wild criticism.
Wild criticism.
Well, what I find is that most people either don't read carefully or don't read at all, and just sort of they read what they want to read. And so if you say gun laws are insufficient, they say, well, that's just crazy. And then they go and then they want to supply various statistics that really don't make sense. And then they want to use cliches and name-calling rather than actually engage the argument.
Cliches and name-calling. I've noticed that a little bit myself. I'll be honest with you. Now, have you talked about this in your classes that you teach at Duke?
Sure, and not necessarily just within the realm of gun rights, but
sure,
in the larger conversation of what value do laws and constitutions add, because one of the motivating arguments is for limited government in general, which means limited, sort of fewer laws in general, that it ought to be the responsibility really of the individual, their family, and their community. This idea, I guess we're floating the term subsidiarity, has been introduced into the modern lexicon by Paul Ryan, but it's been around in the Catholic social teaching for years, that idea that we ought to build from the community up.
You kind of broke up on us there, Dr. Scott. No, I'm sorry. You mind repeating that from about Paul Ryan on?
Sure. This idea of subsidiarity, this Catholic social teaching that we ought to begin with the individual and the community and the family and not go to government initially. That is, build from the community up and only turn over those things to the government that are absolutely essential, not go to the government as a first resort.
And again, I realize we're kind of getting outside of the boundaries of just gun rights, but, as we look at where not just the United States is, but where a lot of developed countries are right now in terms of running budget deficits, I saw that the Netherlands government apparently has collapsed because they couldn't agree on austerity measures. Is this a philosophy, political philosophy, that you think is going to gain resonance as the 21st century moves forward?
Well, I would like to say yes because all empirical evidence points supports it, but most of our movement tends to be exactly the opposite. It's sort of counterintuitive. That is, government produces a lot of these problems by introducing in our monetary policies and those sorts of things. And they say, you know what? Since we mess it up, the exact thing we need is more government involvement. So it just seems counterintuitive.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, there's human nature for you. Hey, listen, Dr. Scott, I really appreciate you coming on the program. I had a great time talking to you, and hope we can do it again.
Yes, thank you very much. I really appreciate it.